There's contact. All right, our presentation. The presentation is ready. I can see perfectly. Participants are connecting. Cool. Yeah. Let's wait half a minute so everyone can join, and then we'll start today's session. Hello to everyone who just joined. Oh, people are joining nicely. Cool. Well, it seems no one else is joining for now. I think we can start. Good morning, everyone, dear friends. Welcome to the course on developing a job profile. This is lesson number 3. Today we're talking about competency descriptions for a position. It's an important part of any profile. We've already talked a bit about what competency is and why it's important. Today we'll continue on this topic. This is the 3rd class. We're right in the middle of the course today. And today we'll discuss what competencies are, their usefulness for a job profile, how to research and describe competencies. That's our plan for today. Okay, let's begin. So why do we even need this company? The fact is, in today's world, companies are mainly starting to compete based on the people who work for them, because people create everything. It's not about the land they own. Well, yes, of course, there are mining companies, oil companies, for example. They compete based on their locations, but many companies are no longer competing with land. They don't compete with factories. Yes, there's industry where the factory itself is a competitive advantage, but there are fewer of these compared to all companies in the world. Consequently, what now separates or distinguishes two companies is essentially the people who work in those companies. So what kind of people and how they work, what they know, how they behave is basically what differentiates companies. That's why in today's economy, in the world we live in, people are considered a competitive advantage. The better the people, the stronger the company. Next, many companies are becoming tech savvy. They use various automation systems, all sorts of equipment and so on. And how well people understand all this is also a competitive advantage, and is the degree of people's knowledge and technology is how much companies can leverage. Therefore, to run a modern business, in our 2021, companies need to manage people, and in particular, what competencies these people have. As we already know, the company manages the business through people's hard skills and soft skills. That's the correlation. Therefore, any successful company tends to implement a hard skills management system, thus introducing the language of competency in order to start managing it. Here are examples of how companies do this. For example, there's a large company in Ukraine. Well, not in Ukraine, it's global, but they have an asset in Ukraine. Hello. They are developing a competency model that they believe is important for the success of their business. These are the competencies they've chosen for themselves: change management, effective communication, strategic thinking, results orientation, customer focus, learning and development, teamwork, decision-making. In my opinion, 8 competencies is quite a lot, but apparently the company is so large and systematic that it can handle them effectively. Let's move on. This is called the company's competency model. That's what it says, Metal's competency model, as the company presents it. What is a competency model? As far as I can see from your examples, you have it too, but we need to understand it well. A competency model is a combination of knowledge, skills, and characteristics required to effectively perform a role in an organization. And this competency model is used in all tools and directions: selection, training, development, assessment, succession planning, rewards, feedback, and so on. That's what the competency model is for. Here's another example of a competency model as a way to manage a company's strategic direction. So Kernel is another company. I think it's also international, with assets in Ukraine. It's an agribusiness company in the agricultural sector. Accordingly, the company has a strategic idea. And then there are strategic goals. And on the other side, there are corporate values and a competency model as a manifestation of these values. So you see, the company views these as 2 tools, sometimes described as 2 legs, standing on the left and right foot. When a company seeks to achieve strategic goals, it must stand firmly on 2 feet. So one leg is all about goal setting. It's KPIs, goals management, and so on. KPIs and everything related. And the second is behavior. This is dictated by values in the competency model. Together, when there's the right goal direction on one side and the right behavior on the other, it ensures strategy implementation. So we can say that implementing a competency model is a strategic tool that helps the company achieve its strategy. Whether this company realizes it now or not, that's how it is. That's how it's used in the world. If we take, well, probably all the companies in the S500 or Fortune 500, the most valuable, most successful companies, you will find in every company actually a competency model because they have realized that this is very important to them. Like basically every company, you will find a system of goal setting and performance measurement. Without it, we won't meet a company successful enough to go to the top. Let's move on. So the competency model includes both innate and acquired aspects and are essentially a pyramid. At the top of this pyramid is human behavior. That is, we are ultimately interested in the behavior that a person exhibits. But we need to understand that this is behavior. It is made up of innate abilities of personality characteristics, as well as acquired skills and knowledge. And it's all demonstrated in behavior, which suggests that when we work with the competency model, even with people who don't have any innate abilities, we can bring their behavior closer to the desired behavior through exposure to their skills. Skills can still be called experience that a person has, and knowledge. Skills is a way. It is the practice of applying knowledge. Let's move on. For a competency model to be useful as an HR tool, competencies must be defined along with examples. We call these examples, as you remember, behavioral indicators. Behavioral indicators are sometimes referred to as descriptors, well, more in psychological language. So behavioral examples, behavioral indicators, descriptors are all the same thing. That is, it is how the behavior within the competency is described. This is to illustrate when a specific competency is demonstrated. Although innate characteristics are mostly fixed in humans, behavior can be modified and trained. Well, that's the goal of the competency model. Let's move on. Development of a competency model. The data collection process for developing a competency model may consist of interviews, questionnaires, and focus groups. Basically, you already know these two tools from the job description. Group focus is a shady new tool. It's when people gather and through dialogue give birth to competencies. Focuses on specific behaviors that can be taught or changed through training, coaching, and other developmental approaches. And as you recall, you and I talked about McClellan's work in the first class. So, observing outstanding performers, or we might say employees of the same, helps validate the behavior, that is, to see if we have described it correctly. Described in the model, accurately describing how these individuals perform their work. So, for example, you have your competency model, which is sewn into every pro-corporate value you have. In order to validate this model or test it, you need to ask yourself like this: our coolest employees, the most efficient, they do or don't behave that way. So it's a question for you, first question. How would you rate, on a 10-point scale, the extent to which your best employees are actually exhibiting the behaviors that are now sewn into the company's values? Well, and the profiles you write, 10 points is a straight up super perfect demonstration. I mean, that's a description of their behavior. 0 points is no. It just so happens that the best employees somehow behave in a completely different way than described, which surprises you and begs the question, why is that? How many points would you give it? Let's do it. Feedback from you, your ideas. It's hard to say, I realize it's complicated, but that's kind of purely your expert opinion. It's not like we're collecting any serious data. It's just a dialogue where you share your opinions. Here, the number 7, for example, is accepted. Come on, colleagues. Okay, all right. With 8, I think it's about 8. All right, you got it. But it's not bad enough that it's close enough. Understandably so if it was born within your company and not brought in from outside. So it's just someone who came in and said, look, there are such cool values, let's write them down too. Then it makes sense that it's all 8. Let's move on. Core competencies are appropriate for everyone in the organization and are not dependent on the level of irony. That's how you have them described for all the posts they are in. Example, focus on the customer, that the operator of the eye center, that the original manager, that competency fits. It's just going to be implemented a little differently. But right then and there, it's a big deal. Let's move on. What business needs are addressed in competency models? What skills, knowledge, characteristics are needed to do the job, and what behaviors have the most direct impact on performance and success on the job? These are the kinds of questions you need to ask yourself and managers when developing a competency model. Application of competence. We have the best people available. This is one of the earliest applications of competencies. That is, properly written competencies allow you to hire players. Why? Because they become kind of like a filter. You've taken your best employees, you've described them, that is, you've created like this stencil, or how do you say some figure that you check everyone at the door and ask yourself if this is the person. When we evaluate him, is he as similar to our employee as our other employees or not? And in this way, you increase precisely with us. So you kind of take in the image of your employees. That's the big advantage of the competency model, that when you're with your own described, you start to predict that you're recruiting exactly the same. So for example, if you were forming an Olympic team, you would measure your best athletes, some of their parameters, and then you compared the athletes coming in for interviews, how much they matched up with your best ones. You would realize whether they are capable of becoming champions or incapable. It's the same in companies. Only in sports, it's probably more physical, and in companies, it's more behavioral. Next, maximizing productivity is another area of focus. To maintain the same or higher productivity, people need to have specific skills, knowledge, and characteristics. So when you have your competency model, you compare each current employee to the model, realize what's missing. And then you can further communicate to people on one side what is expected of them. On the other hand, develop these competencies. For 360-degree evaluation too, the competency model is very useful. That is, you can give people feedback on their performance and behavior based on comparing their current behavior to your ideal competency model. We'll talk more about application, how to apply separately. Today we're talking about dealing with competencies. What it is, why it is, and how. Next, as you and I have already seen, the right competency model allows you to align employee human behavior with strategy and values. That's why often when a company develops a strategy as part of a strategic strategy session, there's a values review. That's normal. I mean, for example, your company say, do you have a strategy in place in your company? So do you have an approach such as strategizing? Or is it? Oh, that's great. Accordingly, it is what it is this year. It will probably be updated next year. And most likely when there is a strategy is usually born out of a strategy session. At a strategy session, if done correctly, values are reviewed to determine if current values are aligned with the strategy or if they may need to be revised. We have one for 3 years, but it is adjusted each year. Then maybe when the first 3 years are up, then there will be a major review and there may be value revisions there. I mean, it's something you have to be prepared for. And it's going to be awesome. That is, for example, if you revise your values, you will recruit people differently, evaluate them differently, and communicate differently. Let's move on. Here are examples of different companies' set of values. American Express, Boeing City, Corporation, Financial Company, General Electric, Walmart, Walt Disney. We're going to see probably 2, 3, probably 3 to 8. By the way, I would like to point out that mere assertions or statements of competence alone provide little information without indicators. For example, customer service. It is unclear exactly what kind of service is considered good, what kind of service is considered bad. Their superiority in products, very subjectively, innovation. Customer focus, also not here, understandably. So very behavioral indicators are needed. What are considered the most popular competencies in American companies, even corporations? Frequency of mention means on a 10-point scale, orientation, no absolute leader, a company, or rather there's no value that all companies have. Most popular customer orientation, communication, team orientation, or teamwork, technical expertise, results orientation, leadership, adaptability, innovation. I think it's this. Take any company, you're sure to find some of these things. Let's move on. Competency models, then, are the job models that underlie each competency-based chart. So how do you describe this whole affair? You and I will now look at a 5-step process. Here it is briefly depicted here, but we'll go straight to the step-by-step. I realize you have something. So you're not at the stage of either creating from scratch everything, but rather at the stage of either reviewing, that is revising, or you don't need to revise, you need to validate, that is to make sure that you are doing well and doing things right. That could be a good such conclusion too. So you will now watch today's lesson, analyze it, think about it, say, well, yes, we have everything right, especially so from Diano. That's a good conclusion too. That is, you will be confident in it and will be able to convince any employee leader that your model is the right one. Or you may get the idea that not everything was done that way. And maybe something should be reconsidered. That would be a good conclusion too. Well, the third thing, finally, an option that you might have, you look and think that probably the way we did them and when we did them, it doesn't fully or substantially conform to this approach. Let's do it all over again. We're in the creation phase, you might say. Yeah, I don't know, like I can see what's out there. So these are the kind of options that can either change, save, or start over. Why not? If there are the right conditions for it. All right, let's go. So the first option, when a competency model is developed, right away you need to understand where you will be using it. That is, what will be the main outcome and who will be the primary user of your new competency model. For example, you decide we need this for selection or we need this for evaluation. We need it for development. So it's important to initially determine for ourselves that what we are about to develop, we will use here, here, and here. It can affect how you collect data, and it can affect models and how you describe behavior. So the first thing is it's important to write this down somewhere. Next, you need to figure out who else is going to use it besides the HR team. We need to get the team together and discuss all of this. So for example, recruiting departments, training departments, assessment departments, whatever departments you have, they should all say what they expect from this model and what is important to them. Because the recruiting department will use it to evaluate candidates, training for development. So they will have slightly different approaches to using it. But it's not just HR departments that will use it. Executives are likely to use it as well. Maybe some other departments too. So it's important to understand who will be the users of this competency model and what their expectations are. You can gather a few key executives, present the project, and tell them what we're going to develop. Here's how we're going to use it. Here's what we'll have as an output, and what are your expectations? Or you could say, look, executives could use this right here, here, and here. For example, you could use it in recruiting to compare. You could use it in employee assessment and selecting candidates for promotion, in development, in coaching. So look at what your expectations are for this model. They can give their input too. Next, step number 3, you need to engage key stakeholders. The more people you involve in your project, the greater the acceptance of the competency model will be later. This is a basic principle of HR work. The more people in the company are involved in any HR project, the more the results of that project are accepted afterwards. And vice versa, if something in HR is developed quietly by one person, then it's hard to sell it later. So it's like a law of sales. The more people you involve at the start, the easier it is to spread this to everyone later, because people are already familiar with it. People feel their contribution, people feel the satisfaction of their work, people know they are heard. Next, step number 2 is actually the first step, the preparation step. Step number 2, identify competencies and behaviors that predict and describe superior job performance. What do we do in this step? First, we need to understand where we're going to collect data. There are many different ways to collect data. We'll break it down now. In any case, we can't avoid interviews here, and we'll definitely need the most effective employees here. That is, involving the best employees of the company in developing the competency model is inevitable, but it must happen. Because you need to make sure for yourself that you've captured everything from them. And you should use this argument later when presenting the competency model to management. When they ask why it's like this, you'll say it's because we interviewed our best employees, Sasha, Petya, Masha, Vasya, and they told us these examples and we realized this is what it's about. You can even give a specific example from the interviews. And then they'll say, oh, if that's the case, then yes, you did a great job. Next, you need to choose the format of behavioral indicators because that will be the biggest benefit of the competencies. These can be behavioral indicators, competency levels, and competency requirements for each position. The form can be either only positive indicators or both positive and negative. Well, it's either one or the other, and usually indicators are broken down by levels. That is, mastery of this competency at the first level, the basic level, is this set of behavioral indicators. At the second level, it's this set of behavioral indicators. At the third level, it's like this. And the lack of this competency is demonstrated like this, and you describe the negative ones. So this is the format it could take. The questions that should be addressed in behavioral indicators should describe what the employee should be able to do and what the employee should know in order to do it. As for where to get competency information, we'll look at examples of what they look like later. And in the next session, where we'll be looking at ready-made competency libraries, you'll see how this is most often described. So in this regard, it will be easiest for you because you'll have many examples. Okay, so where can you get competency information? First, from the company's general expectations. That is what the company expects from absolutely everyone. For example, some kind of honesty or something else like customer care. In other words, what the company needs because it's in this type of business or because the company has this strategy. The only thing here is that you shouldn't rely on just one source. Preferably that source should provide one, maybe two competencies. Next, if there's anything regulated by legislation. There are positions and professions where something is regulated by law, like safety measures or confidentiality for lawyers. Well, I don't know, you need to look at if there's anything in your business by legislation that is required of everyone. So it's also better to stitch in a competency model to explicitly enforce implementation of legislation and to be at the highest level in this regard. Third, in the industry. That is, there are times when an industry has some of its own rules, some of its own standards. It's worth a look too, to see if there's anything for your industry. The fourth on the organization is to carry out the mission of the organization. That is, if any competence prices that would perfectly reflect in the vision of the mission of the company. That's what strategizing is born of. Fifth, source by department. So there are times when there are some things that are very important in departments. And it is necessary for all to strive for this, then the most key departments. Next, it was the first source. It's the shared competencies that are for the whole company. Next, it could be competencies that are for a specific position. There may be sources of their own here. You and I think it was in the first session, we said that competencies can be common to the whole company. Competencies can be common for a family of positions, for example, for all CHARs, for all financiers, their own, for all production workers, their own, and can be individualized. So when for each post, or maybe some mix, maybe 3 generic and 2 individual, or maybe 3 generic, 1 for the whole family. Positions and individual. Well, there could be a combination of the two. So for a position, it could be some industry research that says this is the kind of competency that this position needs to demonstrate. For example, as in the case of charms, there is George Bursin, who has done before for Dilot, trend research, honestly separately engaged. Yes, and he posted there that the spellcasters should know and demonstrate something there. You can draw from sources like this. Next, this could be information from suppliers. Some, for example, sites that do their research and say that these competencies are needed or in demand. Here I gave Headhunter as an example, but of course it will be a different site for each position. 3, it could be feedback from customers. That is how customers comment on interactions with the company, both good and bad. Can be a resource or source for what behavior should be, how people should demonstrate. 4, these can be some rules that the company has and that it is important to display in the behavior of the person. That is if they are described, of course. Next 5 could be certification requirements. HR has international certifications for different positions. This is HRCI, for example. In finance, it's ACCA for accountants, CFA for finance, and many others. Project manager has its own certification. There too, you can look at what competencies are important and how people need to demonstrate everything to be successful in their position. Further, If the company implements any processes of the ISA quality program or any other, it can also be prescribed there. What requirements are placed on employees in order to maximize compliance with this certification? Next, source 3 is the documentation of the process. So if a company has all sorts of processes and flowcharts described, they can also be a source of information about what competencies are required of people in order to work. Next, these can be gathering information from people through, for example, interviews. And here we've already said we're taking an approach in which we ask people to give examples of situations, some where they have been most successful. This approach that we use in the interview, it's called the critical incident technique. This technique was developed by Flanagan in the year 1954, and we're asking people to describe a case of effective, efficient human behavior over a period of time and understand how a person acted in a particular situation. Next, there is another way to analyze competencies is to use the repertory grid or grid technique, also called. This technique was developed by George Kelly in 55. And he's in this grid analyzing human behavior in pairs. So here we're kind of comparing different people and looking at what behaviors set them apart, how such a technique works. We take 8-10 employees and rank them. For example, you're describing some salesmen. Take 8-10 salespeople and rank them from best to worst. Then, in order to analyze their competencies that are required, we take a couple of successful employees and one from the group of unsuccessful employees in comparison. For example, take the first, second, and 10th and ask their supervisor a question. Then these two employees, first and second, which in order of effectiveness are similar to each other in the way they do the work or achieve the result, and how the third differs from them in this quality. These are the kinds of responses that allow us to gather useful information. For example, a couple of successful ones always meet work deadlines, while the third one constantly delays or matures task deadlines. And so we go through all the employees. So we go through the next one, first, second, then third, fourth, well, and so on, comparing it to the one below. And here the plus point of the method is that the manager, he imagines specific people. It's not just abstract concepts of what the best salespeople have in common and how the worst differs. He doesn't need to imagine anything. He takes specific employees like Sasha and Petya and looks at what they have in common. Then he takes someone like Vasya and sees how he's different. For the manager, these are real people with specific behaviors he has observed, so he provides very accurate information. The supervisor needs to be able to observe their employees for this to work. If it's a new manager who hasn't seen these employees, this part will be difficult for them. In that case, it would be easier to use the manager's former employees from their previous company. Let's make a list of employees you've worked with for a long time and analyze them. Next, existing documentation like job descriptions can also be a source of information. You can extract information from those as well. Here's a set of questions that can suggest what competencies are required. Next, there can be different forms of assessment. For example, if the company has already evaluated people but didn't have a competency model, that assessment may already include some competencies that were evaluated. Accordingly, those can be used for further analysis. Next, source number 5 is workforce development resources. For instance, if a company has already developed employees, it has developed certain competencies. Apparently, these were identified somehow, so this can also be a source of information. This doesn't mean that any of these sources should be considered mandatory. If something was documented somewhere, we should definitely use it. It's more of a source for gathering information to then keep the most important competencies, but not trying to keep everything. So you end up collecting from different sources, but then you try to compare it all to your best employees. Comparing to the best employees, seeing how well they match these competencies you've gathered from different sources will be the most valid filter, because if your best employees don't meet some competencies, maybe those aren't that important for success in that position. Next, source number 6 is, of course, the interview. More precisely, the full name for this type of interview is a behavioral interview, an interview based on behavioral examples. We call it the BI behavioral event interview. The idea here is that a person's past behavior is the best predictor of their future behavior. And here we can, by evaluating past work, understand what competencies a person needs. You're familiar with this approach. We've already covered it in the last class. The point here is that we compare the person's role directly to the person and see what competencies allowed them to be successful in that role. The approach we use is based on behavioral interviewing and critical incident techniques. That is, during this interview, we ask about all the nuances of specific behaviors where the person may have demonstrated competencies. So here's the challenge. We need to understand what really helped the person deal with the situation, what competencies, what is an incident in this case. It's any specific human activity, which in itself is complete enough to allow inferences and predictions to be made about the person performing the actions. To be critical, the incident must occur in a situation where the purpose or intent of the action seems reasonably clear to the observer, and when its consequences are obvious enough to leave little doubt about its effects. It may happen that during the interview, a person brings up a situation that isn't clear to you, where the consequences are unclear. So this situation doesn't qualify, and we need to look at another situation. For example, the situation is incomplete, or the person doesn't remember it well, or they observed it from the sidelines. It's not their specific situation. Thus, critical incident interviews with top performers are the primary source of data used to build the competency model. Let me remind you, here's the interview template we've used before. The questions here are designed to gather all the information you need. The next source of information gathering could be teams. This could be a focus group where we bring several people together, and the focus group is designed to provide information on issues such as a list of tasks, accountabilities and responsibilities, a list of major projects or contracts, decisions, internal and external customer contacts, and competencies with descriptions, as well as assessment methods. Next, there might be existing competency models already in place in the company. Accordingly, you can also see which of these are worth keeping and which ones you might want to discard. Next, after utilizing all these sources of information gathering, and this doesn't mean you need to use all of them, in your case, you'll likely use just a couple of them. By utilizing all available sources, you build a competency model for your company and your employees. The next thing to do in step 3 is to verify the competencies you've chosen. How? To start, simply show them to representatives of the positions. Tell those top performers you interviewed that based on the interviews with them and their colleagues, you've identified these competencies. And ask what they think about it. Similarly, show them to their managers, show them to top management, and test them in the selected areas. For example, if you were planning to use this in recruiting, then conduct a few interviews to see how well the candidates selected based on these competencies actually fit, and to what extent they pass the further stages, testing, interviews with the hiring manager, and so on. Next, step number 4, the selected development of the competency model needs to be implemented, that is, integrated into the work. It's important to do this as quickly as possible to avoid any delays, so it doesn't end up just sitting on a shelf somewhere, because such a model wasn't developed just to be a model but to be used somewhere. The sooner you start using it, the better for the company, and the more benefit you'll bring to the company. Step number 5. What can and probably will happen is regular updating of competencies. That is, when the company's strategy changes, or when you work with this competency model, you might see that you want to change something. For example, in some companies where we developed a competency model, we made a decision, sometimes after 3 months, sometimes after 6 months, to change something. The most interesting thing we noticed was that 2 competencies often go hand in hand. For instance, we wrote about communication and openness. We realized that these were essentially the same thing. That is, a person can't be open without communication or a good communicator without openness. We combined these 2 competencies into one. There you go. That's what happens. So you might have something similar, or you might see that something you've described isn't actually that important. So you give it minimal weight when evaluating. You get some assessment results, but you realize that the score doesn't really matter, then it's worth removing. You need to look at how the model is used and what reactions it evokes, what results, what desires. Maybe over time you'll see that something is missing. You might want something more from people, something that's lacking, and you'll add something new. That is, treat it not as a living organism, but as a tool that is constantly being updated and developed. Next, what if there are no representatives for the positions? It could be that a company needs to describe a competency profile for a position that doesn't exist. There are options here. Either find the closest existing position and adapt it, understanding that the two positions are very similar. Accordingly, we take from an existing position and adapt it slightly to the new one. Or find people outside the company with similar roles and interview them to describe the competencies. Or just take the general competency model for the company and not focus on any individual reputations to add. Or take ready-made competency libraries and, in a focus group format, work with several managers to select the most relevant ones for the position you're developing, even though you don't have a representative for that position yet. Next, when defining competencies, best practice is to limit their number to 6 to 10 of the most important competencies, with 10 being quite a lot. Some companies describe that many. In principle, the fewer the better, as it's easier to evaluate, develop, and work with them later. For example, if you choose 8 competencies, you need to assess all 8 during an interview. During a 360-degree assessment, you need to evaluate all 8 competencies, but this will involve many questions and take a lot of time for everyone involved in the assessment. These numbers allow you to add the most significant behaviors on one hand and use competency models on the other. Competency requirements. Once you've described your competencies, you need to go through this checklist. It should be able to predict high competence. It must be under the employee's control, meaning they can influence it, and it must be observable by management. It should serve as a basis for competency goals, learning objectives, and performance management. That is, it should be something you can communicate to a person so they understand what's expected of them. Also, it should be usable for competency-based management. Ideally, there should be no fewer than 3 and no more than 5 behavioral indicators at each level for each competency. And these behavioral indicators can be either very positive or very negative, or vice versa. There you go. The format should be determined during the planning phase. That means you need to develop a format in advance in which everything will be described, so that everything described later corresponds to it. Who should write the competencies? Just as we said earlier, it's important to involve both HR and someone who understands the subject area we're developing for a specific position. This could be the manager of that position, a trainer, or an analyst who understands it. In the end, the described competencies will have a title, definition, or description, as well as behavioral indicators and levels. Levels are optional, but many companies prefer to have them. Levels could be, for example, novice, elementary, intermediate, advanced, and expert. That's 5 levels. Maybe 3 levels will be enough for you. Here's an example of a competency: autonomy. It has a name, description, degree of supervision, and amount of decision-making authority. And levels from beginner to level 5 descriptions. In the ready-made competency libraries we'll look at next session, you'll see many competencies and different level options and how they're described. Next, optional elements for competencies. There could be a scale from 1 to 5, increasing in 3 directions. It covers a person's job activities, performance context, and complexity. You first describe very narrow responsibilities at the elementary competency level, and then they expand from there. Context. First very broad, then more specific and increasing complexity. First very simple, then very complex. Here's an example with 5 levels: scope and context. It increases and the complexity grows. Now for the homework assignment. Identify existing HR processes that could be improved with a new competency model. List these processes and describe how they would benefit from a competency model. Example, adaptation. With a competency model, we could introduce employees to the corporate model and shape proper behavior from their first days at the company. Based on interview results from the previous homework, create a competency profile for one position and assign competencies with behavioral indicators. That's the homework assignment. A recommended book for today's lesson is Kudryavtseva's Competencies and Management. This book is specifically about competencies. This concludes our topic on describing competencies. Next, we'll examine ready-made competency and job libraries to see what's available and usable. Once you've described something basic, you'll need to structure, enrich, and refine it for effectiveness. In the fifth session, we'll discuss how to effectively implement this across all business areas. That is, how to use it, what tools it should become, and which processes to involve it in. That's our plan moving forward. If you have questions about today's lesson, ask them now. If not, write down what was most valuable to you today. I'd also like to remind you that we have a Telegram chat where you can ask questions as they arise without waiting for class. You might need some help during the process. Please don't hesitate to post there. I'll be commenting. Well, it seems there are no questions. Looks like it. Then we'll say goodbye. Have a productive end to this week, everyone. And don't forget the homework assignments. See you in a week. Bye-bye. If you have questions while doing your homework, please don't hesitate to ask. That's all. Bye.